Um, Bill, we're going to get to a couple of different sort of longer term things about the situation that we face today as we're sort of hurtling into this Trump presidency. The other day, it occurred to me I was watching James Bond over the break, and I was like, his cabinet looks like Spectre, except more white. But
That's
we'll
right.
get, yeah, but we'll get to that. But you wrote a reflection on Fidel Castro. You actually had the opportunity to meet him several years ago.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about your personal experience meeting him and then sort of use that as a door to get into some of the man's fuller legacy.
So I met him in January 1999. I was on a delegation that Trans-Africa led to Cuba prior to my becoming the president of the organization. Randall Robinson was the president. And we were there to look at the impact of the U.S. blockade on Cuba and on Afro-Cubans in particular. So on the final day of the trip, we were there, I don't know, 7 days, 10 days. The final day of the trip, we were told that we would have an opportunity, we might have an opportunity to meet with President Castro. And we would not know, but we had to hang out at the hotel and wait.
Hmm.
So at about 11:30 p.m., we received notification that he was prepared to meet with us. And so we got on a bus and went to his offices. And we went into a waiting room, and the door opened. And as I wrote in that piece that I composed about Castro, this old man came out,
Hmm.
and I was like a little bit stunned because I still had in my mind the Castro of the 1960s. So this old man comes out in his green fatigues, and he's introduced to everybody. He's not smiling. He's friendly, but not smiling.
About how many people are in the room?
It was quite, well, I would say there were probably all told about 30 people in the room.
Okay, got it.
And so then we were escorted into an area where we were going to meet with him. And Michael, we sat there until 3:30 in the morning.
Wow.
And he never lost any energy.
He was a bull.
He was amazing.
Hmm.
In fact, he seemed like he was getting more energy as things were proceeding. And I had to tell Randall that we actually needed to go back to the hotel to prepare for our flights home. And that was the only reason the meeting ended when it did. What struck me about the meeting, there were many things that struck me. One was you just loved listening to him talk.
Hmm.
I mean, the guy was so smart. But the other thing that struck me was when he talked about race
Hmm.
and in Cuba, race and racism. And one of the things that we had encountered, and I've encountered subsequently, is some level of defensiveness by Cuban officials when people bring up issues about race and racism in the current in Cuba as it is now. And the reality is that Cuba has made more advances in fighting racism than probably any other country in the Western Hemisphere. That said, there are ongoing issues of racism and racial discrimination that exist. It's not institutionally supported. There's no ideology that supports it, but it's there. So on our delegation, we had been speaking with people about it. So we had an opportunity to ask Castro. And to my surprise, he went into this really interesting, in-depth analysis of race and racism in Cuba. And he said, when we took over in 1959, we thought all that we needed to do was to make racism and racial discrimination illegal. So we did that. And we desegregated everything. And then what we realized only later was that was not enough,
Hmm.
and that racism was very deeply seated in Cuban culture, which was not surprising since it had been a Spanish colony and there had been slavery and then neocolonialism. And he said, and that was a big mistake on our part, to underestimate how deeply seated it was in Cuba. And this was, I thought, a very, very interesting revelation and indeed self-criticism by Cuba's leader. And it's interesting about Castro because there's different moments when Castro would come out and say, I was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
He said he was wrong about gays and lesbians.
Right.
He was wrong about religion. He would say that. And it's funny because the way that he's being demonized in the U.S. media, I'm trying to think of U.S. presidents who were prepared to say that they were wrong. And
George W. Bush all the time, man. He was very self-reflective.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know.
There you go.
Bill, be fair. Come on.
Well, it's interesting when you mention Bush because
Right.
let's talk about his father for a second.
Right.
George H.W. Bush was the one who said that he wouldn't apologize even if he knew the U.S. had done something wrong.
Right.
And that's something that I never forgot either.
I didn't even know that quote. That's a heavy.
Hey, it's Sam Seder. Why don't you subscribe to this channel? You can do so right over here. Subscribe.